Gentlemen, this territory here, bordered in red, provides unfettered access to the interior. It must be ceded to the Crown immediately.
Beneath Africa's vibrant cultures, booming cities, and rich landscapes lies a history rarely spoken of, but deeply felt. This is the full story of Africa's silent chains, the unseen legacy of colonialism that continues to shape millions of lives today. From the carving up of nations at the Berlin Conference to the economic systems that still echo foreign rule, this video takes you beyond the surface into the heart of Africa's untold story. You'll discover how colonial borders sparked decades of conflict, how traditional knowledge was suppressed, and how entire economies were restructured to serve distant empires, leaving behind scars still healing today. But this isn't just a tale of pain. It's a story of resistance, resilience, and reclamation. From post-independence movements to the voices of modern African thinkers, we reveal how the continent continues to rise, redefining its identity on its own terms. This video uncovers the chains that weren't always visible, but were always there. It's time to listen, learn, and confront the past to understand the present. Watch now and take the journey through Africa's hidden history. Imagine waking up one day to find your home, your street, your entire city renamed, restructured, and redistributed without a single voice from anyone who actually lived there. That's not a dystopian sci-fi plot. That's how Africa was carved up in 1884. The Berlin Conference wasn't held in Lagos or Nairobi. It was hosted in a stately room in Berlin, Germany, attended by representatives of 14 European powers, none of whom had ever governed the African territories they were about to divide. No Africans were present, not one. And in a matter of weeks, entire nations, cultures, and kingdoms were erased from the map, replaced with straight lines and border curves drawn for convenience, not coherence. These arbitrary lines cut across over 1,000 distinct ethnic groups, splitting families, tribes, and trade routes, while forcing together rival groups who had never shared governance before. The goal? To divide and dominate, to extract and export. By 1914, 90% of Africa was under European control. The continent became a patchwork of colonial holdings, each structured not to serve the people, but to serve the empire. And yet, those lines drawn with rulers in foreign offices still define African countries today. Nigeria, a nation of over 250 ethnic groups. Sudan, once the largest country in Africa, split in two after decades of civil war, rooted in these artificial divisions. Rwanda, Congo, Ethiopia, the echoes of these borders ring in every conflict, every displaced community, every development challenge faced across the continent. But here's the deeper question. If the map itself was never meant for Africans, can true development happen on a foundation built to extract rather than empower? And what does it mean for identity when your country's very shape was someone else's decision? This is not just about borders. It's about the beginning of a long shadow that still stretches over Africa today. A shadow that explains why some countries still struggle with unity, with governance, with peace, not because of who they are, but because of how they were made. So what happens when your nation is born from a conference you were never invited to? When Europeans arrived in Africa, they weren't looking for community. They were looking for commodities: gold, rubber, ivory, oil, cocoa, diamonds. To the colonial powers, Africa wasn't a home, it was a warehouse. A continent reduced to a list of resources, its people reduced to tools for extracting them. Infrastructure was built, yes, but not for Africans. Railroads didn't connect African cities to each other. They connected mines to ports. Roads weren't designed to facilitate trade within countries, but to move goods out quickly and efficiently to Europe. The blueprint of development was upside down. Africa's land was developed only insofar as it served the needs of the colonizer. And behind that shiny facade of civilization was a brutal system of forced labor. Entire villages were conscripted to tap rubber in the Congo Free State, where failure to meet quotas meant mutilation or death. In southern Africa, black laborers worked under white supervisors in mines that made European companies rich and left African families broken. In British East Africa, taxes were imposed specifically to force Africans into low-wage colonial jobs. Even education, where it existed, was designed to produce subordinates, not scholars. Africans were trained to obey orders, not question systems. Skilled trades and technical education were restricted. The colonizer didn't want innovation. They wanted obedience. This wasn't accidental, it was design. So when independence came, many African nations were left with roads to the port, but no industries of their own. They had workers trained to serve, but not to lead. They had fields planted for export, not for food security. A continent rich in resources, but structured to enrich someone else. The real tragedy: this system worked exactly as intended for the colonizer. And its legacy isn't just in statistics. It's in everyday realities: youth unemployment, import dependency, crumbling infrastructure. What happens when a continent is built like a conveyor belt where the product leaves and nothing stays? Colonial powers didn't just seize land, they seized control through systems of governance designed to rule from a distance. It was efficient, cost-effective, and devastating. This strategy, known as indirect rule, turned local chiefs into colonial administrators. They were told, "Govern your people, but do it our way." In British colonies, traditional rulers were co-opted to collect taxes, enforce colonial laws, and suppress dissent. The French preferred assimilation, erasing African identity to mold citizens who mirrored French ideals. The Portuguese clung to direct rule, brutal and paternalistic. Each empire had its method, but the result was the same: governance without representation, leadership without legitimacy. Resistance was constant. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion raged against land grabs and repression. In Algeria, a bloody war against French rule lasted nearly a decade. South Africa's fight against apartheid, a system designed during and refined after colonial rule, spanned generations. These weren't isolated uprisings. They were a continent-wide scream for dignity. Yet when the colonialists finally left, they didn't clean up the mess. The states they built weren't designed to serve the people. They were designed to control them. So post-independence African leaders inherited centralized bureaucracies, fragile institutions, and borders that ignored the realities on the ground. Many new governments tried to reform. Some succeeded, but many fell into the same traps: authoritarianism, corruption, coups, not because of African failure, but because of colonial design. The cold truth is that many African countries were granted flags and anthems, but not sovereignty in the truest sense. Power structures remained tilted, and when local leaders tried to break the mold, foreign powers often intervened, covertly or openly, to keep the status quo. So ask yourself, if a house is built on a crooked foundation, can it ever stand straight, no matter who moves in? Colonialism didn't just redraw Africa's borders, it rewired its identity. To control a people, you must first control how they see themselves. And so, colonial rule came with a quiet war against African culture, language, and memory. Not with bullets, but with books. Not with prisons, but with classrooms. Africans were taught that progress wore a European face, that speaking English or French was a mark of intelligence. that Christianity replaced paganism and European history was universal history. Indigenous languages were dismissed, oral traditions were mocked, ancestral knowledge was labeled primitive. The result? Generations of Africans were taught to see themselves through someone else's lens. Colonial schools didn't just educate, they reprogrammed. African children learned about European kings, but not African empires. They studied Shakespeare, but not Shaka Zulu. They read about the Renaissance, but never the kingdoms of Mali or Benin. Colonized minds became tools of self-erasure. Even names were changed to fit foreign tongues, replacing identity with imitation. But culture is resilient. Across the continent, people resisted, often quietly. They sang songs in forbidden tongues, preserved stories in hushed voices, and celebrated traditions in secret. Today, you'll still find griots in Senegal, kente weavers in Ghana, praise poets in South Africa. Culture fought back, and it's still fighting, yet the legacy remains. Many African countries still use colonial languages as their official ones, creating class divides between the educated elite and the majority. Museums in Europe still house African artifacts taken without consent, and many Africans still wrestle with hybrid identities, caught between pride in heritage and pressure to conform to Western standards. So what does it mean when your own story is told in someone else's voice? And how do you reclaim your past when it was rewritten before you could read it? Colonialism didn't just divide land, it divided economies. Africa was engineered to serve external markets, not internal prosperity. The borders that split tribes and languages also fractured trade routes, separated producers from consumers, and severed the flow of goods that had connected communities for centuries. Before colonization, African economies thrived through vast networks of inter-regional trade. Gold from Ghana, salt from the Sahara, spices from the Swahili coast. But colonial borders turned natural markets into bureaucratic nightmares. Suddenly, selling grain to your neighbor meant crossing a national line, facing tariffs, and needing documents you didn't even understand. And what replaced these ancient trade routes? Export pipelines aimed straight at Europe. One crop, one port, one purpose. Cocoa in Ghana, cotton in Sudan, copper in Zambia. Economies became dangerously dependent on a single export commodity. When prices dropped on the world market, entire nations suffered. That wasn't a side effect. It was the system working as designed. This monoculture model of development ensured dependency. African nations exported raw materials and imported finished goods at a loss. They grew coffee but imported instant coffee. They mined bauxite but bought aluminum. They drilled oil but shipped in gasoline. The economic cycle trapped countries in a loop where value was created elsewhere. Infrastructure mirrored this logic. Railways and roads didn't connect African capitals. They connected mines to ports. Airports served capitals, not rural economies. Colonial development wasn't underdevelopment by accident. It was underdevelopment by architecture. So today, even decades after independence, many African nations struggle to trade with each other more than they trade with their former colonizers. What happens when your neighbor is closer than your capital, but the system keeps you strangers? If you draw a line through a village and call it a border, you've planted a seed, not of unity, but of division. That's exactly what colonial cartographers did across Africa. Lines were drawn to serve empire, not ethnicity. The result? A continent where borders rarely reflect the people who live within them. Take Nigeria, over 250 ethnic groups placed inside one nation, or Rwanda and Burundi, two ethnic groups locked in deadly conflict, rooted not just in history but in colonial manipulation of identity. In Sudan, the North-South divide eventually erupted into a civil war that birthed a new country, South Sudan. And even that wasn't enough to bring peace. Colonial powers often favored one group over another, elevating them to positions of power to rule over the rest. In Rwanda, Belgian rule entrenched ethnic divisions by issuing identity cards labeling citizens as Hutu or Tutsi. In Congo, certain tribes were armed while others were marginalized. Divide and rule wasn't just a tactic, it was a cornerstone. These divisions didn't dissolve with independence, they mutated. In the vacuum left by colonial retreat, ethnic tensions boiled over into coups, civil wars, and genocides, not because Africans are inherently divided, but because the structures left behind encouraged mistrust and competition for power along ethnic lines. Modern African states often struggle with unity, not because the people are unwilling, but because the framework they inherited was never meant to unite. Borders that once served the colonizer now serve instability, and when conflict erupts, it's often misread as ancient tribalism rather than the modern fallout of imperial shortcuts. So ask yourself, if peace is built on understanding, how can it thrive in a structure designed to divide? Walk into any conversation about Africa's challenges and one word echoes louder than most: underdevelopment. But what if underdeveloped isn't a natural state, but a result? Not of African incapacity, but of deliberate design. Colonialism didn't just take resources, it dismantled systems. Health, education, agriculture, industry, every sector was either neglected or shaped to serve someone else's priorities. When independence came, African leaders inherited broken frameworks, hospitals with no funding, schools with no curriculum for innovation, economies without self-reliance. And yet, they were expected to thrive overnight. But the legacy wasn't just internal, it was global. New nations stepped into a world economy tilted against them. Former colonial powers returned, not with armies, but with contracts. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international lenders, like the IMF and World Bank, demanded cuts to public services and opening of markets, often worsening poverty. Aid became a tool of influence. Debt replaced chains. Even now, multinational corporations extract minerals from African soil and pay pennies in taxes. Foreign investments come with strings. Trade terms remain unequal, and when African leaders push back, they're painted as unstable, corrupt, or anti-progress, while the real puppeteers stay hidden. Yes, there are internal issues: corruption, mismanagement, conflict. But those are symptoms, not root causes. You can't treat a fever by ignoring the infection. And the infection, in many cases, is a global system still profiting from Africa's weakness. So the question isn't why Africa is poor. The question is, who benefits from Africa staying that way? And what would happen if the continent truly owned its own path? Africa's story isn't just one of pain. It's one of resistance, resilience, and renewal. The chains of colonialism may have been forged in silence, but they're being broken in voice, in vision, in action. The continent is rising not because its past is forgotten, but because its future refuses to be defined by it. Across the continent, movements are reclaiming identity. From the decolonization of education in South Africa to the resurgence of indigenous languages in Kenya and Nigeria, Africans are writing their own narratives in their own voices. Artists, academics, and activists are challenging Eurocentric worldviews and rebuilding memory where it was once erased. Economically, the push for self-reliance is gaining ground. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, aim to undo colonial trade barriers and unlock intra-African commerce. Local industries are being nurtured. Technology hubs in Nairobi and Lagos are proving that innovation doesn't only come from Silicon Valley. The goal isn't just growth, it's ownership. Politically, the call for reparations is growing louder. From the return of stolen artifacts in European museums to financial compensation for centuries of exploitation, there's a reckoning underway. But more important than money is dignity, recognition, truth, acknowledgement that history isn't past, it's present. Still, the struggle continues. Breaking chains is harder than forging them. It takes vision, solidarity, and time, but the fire is lit. Africa is not waiting for rescue. It's building its own rescue team, and that's the most powerful legacy of all. If you've made it this far, thank you. Share this video. Start a conversation. And remember, history isn't just something we study, it's something we change. Like, comment, and subscribe to support more untold stories.